Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are on the planet. This is the Sustain What webcast of Columbia University's Earth Institute, and it's my pleasure today to explore the work and observations of Global Press, which is both an institute and a journal. It's one of the most innovative models for enabling ground up reporting in some of the world's toughest places to do any kind of reporting that I've seen in recent, actually any time in my career. There's several different elements we'll explore. The fact that it's all women, the fact that they have some really innovative training programs so that they have really interesting standards about how to use language, which I think the New York Times and others could use could take some insights from. I think we'll just get started. I'm Andy Revkin. I've been a journalist for 35 years, and now I'm running a new initiative at Columbia, at the Earth Institute, on communication and sustainability. Essentially, the task I set myself is to make information matter. We live in a world that's suffused with data and information and assertion right now, but the hard thing is to cut through the noise. Quite often, it's not a matter of communication access even. It's a matter of how do you use these tools for best effect. So I'd love to start with by introducing the panel today who are in Laxmi, where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C., Andy.
Yeah, so Washington, Colombo in Sri Lanka, and in Zimbabwe. Where in Zimbabwe are you, Kudzai?
I'm in Harare.
In Harare. So I guess the first thing here is to allow each of you to introduce yourself and get a sense on the ground of what conditions are like in our coronavirus moment that we're all going through. An incredible juncture in human history right now. Let's start with Laxmi, because you're the chief operating officer for a year or two or three. When did you join this?
Like that? Yeah, it's been a few years now.
Yeah. So can you just offer a description of the overall enterprise and tell us a little bit about your situation and what Washington is like these days? I haven't been down since it started.
Absolutely, Andy. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us today and for saying such kind things about the organization. Truly do believe that what we've built and what we continue to build is the future of international reporting. So Global Press is an international news organization that trains and employs local reporters in undercovered communities around the world. So Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, Haiti, Nepal. These are some of the countries where we have news bureaus around the world. And so though I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., we are managing a massive network of reporters, local reporters around the world, as well as copy editors and fact checkers and translators. So it's a really robust network that focuses on redefining what international journalism is. Hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more about that.
Great. And Manori, you have a job managing the enterprise all through Asia. Is that correct?
That's right. I work as the regional program manager for Asia, and I'm also a trainer in Asia. And now I'm also doing training in other regions for Global Press. I live in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and I've been with Global Press for a little over 10 years. I started as a reporter at the Sri Lanka desk and then transitioned into various roles. Global Press is an amazing place of opportunity and growth. So as Global Press grew, I grew too, and got many opportunities. And now I'm, trainer and program manager for Asia.
And so maybe we could talk a little bit about the training before we get into some of the stories that are on the plate right now. What do you think distinguishes how Global Press, the Institute part, has worked from the way journalists tend to come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll, of course, let Minori give a lot of examples, particularly from Asia, but our training is all done at Global Press Institute, which is our training to employment arm of the organization. And the idea is that all reporters, regardless of whether they have previous journalism experience or not, go through a very rigorous 4-month journalism training where they are learning the basics of fact checking, of photojournalism. They're learning intermediate skills in interviewing. So they're going through all of these different phases to prepare them for the Global Press Journal newsroom, which is very different than other training programs that I've personally seen working in media development over the last decade. The idea here is that reporters actually are ready for employment at the end of this. So they are guaranteed to be employed by Global Press Journal as long as they graduate from this program. And Minori actually has recently been training a team in Nepal, recently graduated a team in Sri Lanka. So perhaps you want to tell us about some of those experiences.
Yes, sure. So in Nepal, we have 6 amazing women who are currently going through the training process. It's on pause because of the lockdown that's underway in Nepal. And they come from various backgrounds and cover a vast array of ages and life experiences. We have reporters from 4 different parts of the country. And what our training model actually brings is this diversity, which is one of the core values of Global Press as well. And this diversity in our trainees is then seen in the diversity of the stories and the experiences they bring. And it just creates such a richness in everything we produce as a result.
Yeah, I'm so glad you spoke about the diversity, Minori, because we go to extreme lengths to find the reporters that join our network. When Minori joined 10 years ago, when Kudzai joined several years ago in Zimbabwe, we received thousands of applications, hundreds of applications around the world for very limited reporting positions in each country. And we go to great extents to be able to offer this opportunity in some of the most remote parts of a country where English is not necessary in order to be in our newsroom. So that means we just have to work even harder to make sure that we're making all of our opportunities accessible in multiple languages.
That's pretty great. And how many women are currently in the network overall globally?
Yeah, so we have a network of just over 100 reporters around the world. But of course, that also includes our Global Press Accuracy Network, which is our network of translators and fact checkers, interpreters, copy editors. All of that is really integral to the journalism that we produce.
So it's kind of an ecosystem.
Absolutely.
And again, it's very different than the traditional model of journalism, where sort of a journalist will start at one publication and kind of work her way or his way up through, to a bigger one and a bigger one, and maybe make the big time someday. But here you're kind of building that distributed capacity from the get-go. There's no kind of, it's just an interesting model.
Yeah, the professional development aspect, perhaps Kudzai can talk about this a little bit more, but any reporter that joins our network is provided training and professional development opportunities throughout their career as a Global Press Journal reporter, which is dramatically different than what you're seeing in other newsrooms. The idea that we will always invest in training, learning and development across a reporter's career allows us to have reporters like Marisa Revilla in Mexico, who's been with us for 14 years. And you can see how her journalism on globalpressjournal.com has evolved as she has evolved as a reporter working with Global Press Journal. But I'm sure Kudzai has some examples to share as well.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Kudzai now. How did you become part of the network? And we can get to the current situation on the ground in a few minutes.
Okay. Well, I applied, and then there was a selection process, and we had to go through like training to actually reach the part where you actually are, graduate to a point where you're now like an actual, global press reporter. So it wasn't just, having to have gone through, journalism courses in school, which, most of us have, but you also have to learn how to be a global press reporter. So in this instance, I've been with Global Press for about 4 years now, and we're constantly learning new things and growing and evolving as reporters. Like off the top of my head, I can think about the photojournalism course that we all took and that we keep refreshing, annually. It makes me into like a better, not only just taking images that go along with the story, but also photojournalistic images that tell a story on their own. So that's what I can pick off the top of my head. But there's a lot of other like processes that just make us better reporters in general.
I should mention one of my all-time favorite stories on Global Press Journal was covered by Kudzai, and it was about rangers in Zimbabwe. And the images in this story alone are just phenomenal. They're stunning, but they also tell such a powerful and moving story.
Yeah, that focus on multimedia, essentially, the journalism, the written part, and the photography also is very distinct from the way a lot of journalists were trained in my generation, where not only that, even at the New York Times when I was there, for the longest time, the unions didn't let a reporter take a picture. They had a rule when I was writing for the regional part of the New York Times that I had to be 50 miles away from New York City for me to take a picture. It was kind of funny. And so I tended to try to do that. I tried to get away from the office as much as possible so I could be liberated to do visual journalism as well. And I think that idea of integrating it from the start feels very valuable to me. And you actually have fairly standardized, even I think when I visited the office in Washington, there's a particular camera you're using. It feels like, anyway, the way it's integrated feels really, really refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of employing 100% local women reporters around the world means that we have to be smart about how we are carrying our technology. We're not carrying giant lenses with us because that's not inviting to our sources. That's not something that's going to be welcome in a lot of communities. So when we're talking about, it's a funny example you share, Andy, of not being able to take a photograph of a community that you're from seems very counterintuitive to the Global Press way of doing things, where, as we see so many foreign correspondents today grounded because of coronavirus, our reporters are locally based. They're in their communities. They have the context. They have the nuanced analysis. They have access, unprecedented access to sources that make them really what is the future of international reporting, because they have this access even during a coronavirus pandemic.
Right. Now let's talk about this, the current situation a little bit. Let me just shift this back to this pattern. Sadly, right now, the Periscope portion of our live stream doesn't seem to be working. There's some glitch. I keep trying to link it in. Unfortunately, that's the one that goes on to Twitter, which is a drag, but we'll figure that out. Technology can be our friend, and it can be incredibly frustrating at the same time. So maybe you could describe a little bit, each of you, about the adjustments that are underway, and how do you keep reporting on something when you can't be face-to-face in many situations with the people you're reporting on? So many journalists want to actually see the thing to be convinced that it's real before reporting on it. It's part of our standards and stuff. But so what's going on? Maybe we'll start with Asia.
Yes, sure. Asia, where, the whole pandemic started. And Mongolia was one of the countries outside China that first went into lockdown. Now we have, our reporters in Mongolia had just recently graduated from the 16-week training program into Global Press Journal, and they had just started working as reporters in early January. And then within a week or two, the country announced that it was going into a phased lockdown situation. Universities and schools were closing. They were stopping all transport across the districts. And, public events were being banned. And basically, the country was going into a gradual lockdown. So our new reporters had to adapt to this. Our editorial team worked with them in coming up with, lots of different ways that they could still be productive and engage in their reporting work while following the lockdown rules. And they did that. They did an amazing job, as you'll see on globalpressjournal.com. They produced both stories and amazing photography. They captured what was happening then and there in Mongolia. And we have 6 bureaus in Mongolia. So we had all this information coming from one of the least covered places in the world. And we had stories and photographs about how communities were adapting through decontamination of roads, the impact on schools, kindergartens, and playground places, because Mongolia has a very young population. And so families with young children, how were they coping? We had stories about how different trades, people in the community, how their income and livelihood were impacted. And all this happened in February and March when they had the lockdown. And that lockdown is now, coming out, and they're back to doing a regular full-time reporting. So that's one example from Asia.
That's great. And in Southern Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, how are things going? Here's a couple of...
reporting here hasn't necessarily been a walk in the park. I'm talking about Zimbabwe in general. I'm sure if you take a look at one of the articles that I actually did that are on globalpressjournal.com, you will see that there have always been challenges in reporting here. But now, because of this pandemic and the enforced lockdown, that it has been a bit tricky. It's more trickier. But because Global Press Journal reporters actually are in the situation, they are in these communities, so it's not as it's not a impossible feat, if because we generally speak the same language as most of our sources, they find it easier to talk to us. Let me just bring in an example about one of the articles that is published actually on the site about, the informal markets and how the people are coping now due to the coronavirus. In as much, it's very difficult for us as Africans, to talk about, how tough situations are, when it comes to money and livelihood, especially opening up to people that you don't know. So, us being locals and being in these communities, it gives this level of familiarity and like a bit of like community and trust. So they trust us with their information, which makes it easier to report on difficult situations like this. So we have had to minimize the human contact. We can still talk to them. We can still talk to them over the phone. They still feel more comfortable talking to us because we are in the situation, so they know that we can be able to tell their stories accurately and in a dignified manner.
Yeah, and it's particularly challenging there too, because this isn't the only pandemic that's affecting that region. On Friday, we had a long discussion with 3 journalists who covered HIV/AIDS from the very beginning: Laurie Garrett, Bob Bazell, and John Cohen. And we were talking a lot about not only the lessons from HIV/AIDS back in the 80s, but also this, we touched on this challenge of there are actually places, even now also with polio, there's polio eradication efforts this year that are being disrupted by coronavirus response. So it's pretty complicated. And I see this story here as well by one of your colleagues gets at that challenge. And of course, in places with very little healthcare capacity to begin with, you have the question of the impacts of the response itself, meaning if people can't get to hospital for what's this going to do for maternal mortality rates, et cetera. So that makes this a particularly urgent and tough story that you're facing.
Kudzai, and thinking about the story that she's just gone.
maybe she'll pop back.
Well, I will share a little bit about a story that Kudzai recently worked on in Zimbabwe. As we know, Zimbabwe has had decades-long economic crisis, and that makes it particularly unique to be covering a pandemic in a country that has little capacity to be able to respond to regular healthcare challenges. But I think it was a great example of how our reporters, Linda Majuru, Gamuchurai, and Kudzai were able to collaborate on this piece. And we're seeing that kind of collaborative journalism across our teams to be able to tell a more holistic story of something that's quite complex, that ties in a really complex economy story with the healthcare. Well, I just plugged your collaborative piece that you did with Linda and Gamu, but I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that.
The network here is so up and down, so yeah, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
But you know, if I understand your question correctly, you know, it's a difficult it's a kind of being a situation where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, you know, when it comes to, you know, this whole pandemic about coronavirus. You know, there's so many other things that are happening here, like, you know, there's HIV, there's hunger, you know, there's food insecurity, there's so many other situations that locals have to deal with on a daily basis, and they also factor in on our response to the virus. You know, should we have like an unprecedented number of people who get attacked? So now, you know, talking about the HIV situation, you know, when your immune system obviously is compromised, that means that you are more likely to suffer greatly from coronavirus. So here there's a whole situation where, you know, due to the health sector being basically on its last leg, people cannot get tested. Those people living with HIV, which is a significant percentage of the population, you know, they don't know whether their viral load is okay, if they need their medicine adjusted. So all of this factors into the whole fear aspect, because now people don't want to move, they don't want to get out of the house, but then that also means that they stop working, and it's just a fatal domino effect that is just, you know, we just feel like we're basically going around in circles, and there is no, you know, hope, basically.
And just as is the case here, I've heard that in several parts of sub-Saharan Africa where there are elections underway or the like, you have this really charged issue with rumors and false assertions getting in the way of conveying accurate news. I'm not sure about Zimbabwe particularly, but some friends in a couple of other countries in sub-Saharan Africa have talked about the you're seeing the same kind of Trump effect. It's not just Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil. There are these places where the politics framing around these things gets everybody making assertions that then really can be dangerous in terms of how they cloud public response. Does that feel like something you've been hearing a lot about?
I mean, in most situations, this does happen, which is why, you know, when we deal with global press stories, we actually make sure that whatever it is that we produce is accurate and it has been corroborated, and we've done the research about it. But yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I know Laxmi and I were having this discussion. I think she would like to chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you're talking about fact checking and some of the rumors that spread very quickly during a moment like this in a pandemic, it just makes the human fact checking that we do so much more important and frankly required for any piece of journalism that we're publishing, right? So we can't be sitting here in Washington, D.C. and ensuring that every piece is completely accurate. This requires collaboration with reporters like Kudzai, with our fact checkers, with our entire Global Press Accuracy Network. But there's also, there's other layers of miscommunication and things that get lost in translation that happen well before the fact-checking phase. So Kudzai mentioned she speaks Shona. She speaks the local language that her sources speak. So she doesn't need to take a translator along with her to essentially be her interpreter on that in that moment. Minori has multiple examples from this coronavirus experience where the Sri Lankan government shares information in Sinhala and in English, but not in Tamil, which is the language that's spoken in Jaffna, where our news desk is. So in order for us to come together and share information with our reporters, even from a duty of care standpoint, not just from the reporting standpoint, is critical for our reporters.
Maybe Manori, are there some aspects of that come to mind? Any particular examples recently?
Yes. In fact, just today there was a heat wave warning that the government's Met Department issued for the country, and it affects the region where our reporters live. But like Laxmi said, a lot of the information that is shared is not shared in the language of use in that part of the country. So we, as part of our duty of care, had to have our translators work on a message that took the content that's available in English and Sinhala, translate it into Tamil, and share very precise and accurate information with our team so that they could take the precautions they need to this week to guard themselves from this heat wave that's expected to affect that part of the country. And the same we've seen again and again with coronavirus information. So the fact that we work in multiple languages has been really useful in this instance. We have the systems, we have the translators, and we have the local knowledge and understanding to do accurate translations and to do it quickly. And so we've been able to keep our team updated with very precise information in the local language so that they are not part of the misinformation that is also spreading in Sri Lanka, excuse me, due to the lack of access to information in local languages.
That's amazing. And I think I heard the other day from one of you how frequently you're in touch with the reporters. It's sort of a twice a day check-in or something like that.
Yes, they do. So I just before this call, finished my check-ins with my team in Asia. So all the reporters in Asia check in with me every single day. And we've been doing this since since late January. So now it's over 3 months. Every single day they check in. Nobody considers it tedious or a waste of time, because it's become such a part of global press culture that we communicate when there's a situation that puts a reporter's safety at risk in any way. And like everyone knows it. Last year, for example, in Sri Lanka, when the Easter bombing attack happened, within seconds of me getting the news, I was having calls from reporters just checking in and saying, okay, I'm fine. Are you okay? And just checking in. And that happens wherever our reporters are. They have a very clear system of knowing who to check in with. So the daily check-ins continue in Asia for the foreseeable future. It's part of what we do, part of the duty of care, the actual care part comes in there.
How did that evolve? Laxmi, I know Christy Hagrains, who was one of the founders, she's on maternity leave, but you must know the history well enough to understand how this approach evolved.
Yeah, so duty of care is one of the things I love most about global press, and it is frankly what is very disappointing that I haven't seen this in other news organizations. Because it's not just a training program, which so many security programs are. This isn't about security. This is a holistic approach to ensuring that our reporters are prepared for many different situations that they may find themselves in. So duty of care is something that we've practiced at the organization for over 14 years now. And as you mentioned, Christy Hedgrens, the founder of Global Press, which was founded in 2006, has really focused on this element of the organization over many years now. But what we ultimately are focusing on is not just the training, also our policies, our protocols, our procedures, whether it's checking in, whether it's ensuring that reporters have the tech that they need. So we take 4 elements of duty of care very seriously. We focus on mental well-being. We focus on physical well-being, as well as digital security and legal security. So these 4 elements are really critical to the holistic approach that Global Press takes. And really, it's about 75% on a holistic approach in policies, procedures, and how we kind of make this an ethos inside of the organization where reporters aren't frustrated that we're doing check-ins every day, but maybe Kudzai can talk about this and hopefully they know and feel that this is something that is kind of our bread and butter and that we care.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear from Kudzai a little more on that. And also, it sounds like, again, it's a true community.
It is. It is like a community, because I mean, for you to do your job well, you need to feel safe and secure and, you know, heard. And so that is it's a very important part of, I feel, working at Global Press. I think the example that I can pull out right now is, I think about, you know, just before the lockdown was announced here in Zimbabwe, when the first coronavirus related death occurred, we anticipated that a lockdown or a national shutdown was imminent. So we actually spoke to the global team at HQ, and we told them our concerns, and we raised the issue that maybe we would need to have some funds wired to us prior to this, so that we can set ourselves up in terms of getting the required PPE, which is the personal protective equipment, your masks, if you need medication, because we had to buy things in advance, because we didn't know what was going to happen. And because Global Press is such a listening and caring organization, that was organized for us. And we went through this shutdown period, the first 21 days, where people didn't know what was happening, whether shops were going to be open, or people going to afford food. But we were taken care of in terms of our physical and even emotional well-being. So
yeah, I think what's been so fascinating about this moment is Global Press has managed many different crises over even just 2019. Minori mentioned the Easter Sunday bombings. We've, mosquito-borne dengue is a real concern for many of our reporters. But coronavirus is happening everywhere, every bureau, every moment. And so it's just heightened our duty of care protocols. And we're constantly doing those check-ins every day, but it's something that's already practiced within the organization. And now we're just fine-tuning and honing in on what we already do. But it is really important to be culturally responsive to what's happening in the reporter's environment. Noella recently did a story from DRC, which you can read on Global Press Journal, and it's such a fascinating story. It talks about how DRC was just declaring that they were coming out of an Ebola epidemic, just declaring the country Ebola-free when coronavirus hit. And so whether it's from an editorial standpoint or from a duty of care standpoint, we need to be extremely tuned in to the real challenges that our reporters are facing. Reporters just coming out of an Ebola crisis and entering a new pandemic is a very different setting than others that haven't actually experienced an epidemic before.
Right. I'm going to ask a quirky question. Is there something about women, the female gender, that is behind the shape of this, some of the holistic aspects? Is that a good or a bad question even to ask? It feels so distinctive in the context of the history of journalism, which was for so long dominated by guys like me, that I just wonder about that. I just recently on Twitter, I was asking a bunch of futurists. Futurists is a profession. They're people who study systems, and they work, they get contracts with the Defense Department or with the health agencies to do epidemic planning. And I asked this batch of futurists who seem the ones you hear online, the ones you see the most, Steven Pinker, Taleb, the guy who wrote back Black Swan. They're also kind of, it's like Guyville. And it turns out there's this big batch of futurists who are female, but they're sort of not the figures you see on TV or on TED Talks as nearly as much. And I want to do a test to see if they have different, if you could do like a case control, a look at the futurist scenarios from the women in that arena versus the ones from men, whether they have characteristics that are different. So I'm just throwing that out there. Does that feel like a thing or not?
Interesting question, Andy. And I have some pretty strong opinions about this, I have to say. The first is that I truly hope that this isn't just a women-led movement, because every newsroom everywhere in the world requires the approach that Global Press takes. There is a lot that newsrooms can learn from our approach, whether that is because we happen to be a woman-led organization. We of course have wonderful team members that are not women, but our reporter core is 100% female. But there is something to that. It means we have unprecedented access to sources that just reporters in the countries that we are covering often do not have. The trust of the reporter, whether it's through the fact that they're not standing next to a translator that's interpreting for them, whether it's through the fact that they are from the communities that they're covering. But that approach alone, the fact that our reporters are from the communities they live in, whether they are women or not, they have unique access. And they show this time and time again each year when we do our reporter surveys to see, how many of our source interviews were done in person. It's always above 90%. That trust is imperative to the kind of reporting that we do. And it's really not a matter of whether this is a woman-led approach or not. I frankly just think that we're no longer in a world where we need men to be translating the world for us, the way that you describe the past of journalism.
Right. One thing I've been focusing on more and more in the last few years is community scale capacity for communication as well, where the interface of journalism itself isn't always there between the public and policymakers and the like. There are some models emerging around tough perennial issues like climate change. There's an organization in the Midwest called the Jefferson Center, which has been doing rural climate dialogues and rural energy dialogues, where they go into a community and foster a discussion among representatives of the community, different, farmer and a public official and someone with climate background. And it's not even, there's the filter of a journalism newsroom isn't there. And it's really an interesting model as well. And to me, and you think about the scale question of having to boost resilience, whether it's to disease or to climate risks, in so many communities around the world, rich, poor, distributed. There is a clear role for journalism, and maybe some of that role is actually facilitating local capacities more than interpreting local situations. I don't know if that feels like a next step has that come to mind in some contexts of reporting on stories that you guys have done? Where journalism is sort of enabling something rather than interpreting?
I think enabling versus interpreting. I'm not sure, Minori or Kudzai, if you have any ideas, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is coming out of this pandemic, that international reporting is just never going to be the same. We have proven over the last 4 to 5 weeks now that we are still able to cover the communities that global press reports from. We are still able to operate, and we're able to do it safely. You know, we just no longer require, frankly, I don't think we ever did require that translation. But this is a turning point that I see. And we, you know, if you'd read any one of Kudzai's stories, she's not telling the rest of the world a few, you know, very basic facts about what's happening in her community. She's doing what's called consequence-driven journalism. She's focusing on the consequences of what's happening in her community related to coronavirus or whatever else it is that she's covering. And Kudzai, I'm sure you can talk more about your reporting much more eloquently than I can.
Okay. So, you know, just to pick up from what where Laxmi dropped off, what we do mostly is it's consequence-driven reporting, which is different from action-driven reporting, which is what normal, you know, your normal daily stories do. Where, as for instance, they can say, oh, okay, on Friday, the 1st of May, the president of Zimbabwe lifted partially the lockdown and opened up some big businesses. You know, you can go back to work if you get tested and, you know, wear the PPE. So that's your action type of reporting. So what we do is we focus more on what that means for in the long term. So for instance, dating back to the story that I was talking about that you can find on the site about informal markets and, you know, how they're dealing with the coronavirus and the shutdown. So Zimbabwe, you know, Zimbabwe's population depends, 80% of Zimbabwe's population actually depends on the informal market to survive. So we're not just talking about people making money from it. We're talking about people who go and buy food there. They get their commodities and stuff because they cannot afford to actually go in a supermarket and do their grocery shopping. So when they shut down, like the national shutdown and it's a lockdown, everybody go back to your houses, quarantine, this affected a significant number of people. So whereas people were reporting about, oh, now it's time for the 21-day lockdown, we were focusing more on what does that mean for the regular person. And they talk about this, you know, they tell us that, you know, I can't even afford to stay 3 days at home without going to work because I live hand to mouth. And so if I'm not out there hustling to make money to feed my family, in 3 days, I'm going to be out of food. And then where's that going to leave me? So that's the type of reporting style that we do. It focuses more on what this means in the long term for the regular person. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Laxmi or Minori.
Actually, yeah, I do, Kudzai. So, Andy, one of the things that I think Global Press really brings out in terms of being relevant is this local access. The fact that we are able to provide a very nuanced analysis of the reality of our communities. I'll give you an example from Kashmir, Indian-administered Kashmir, where we have reporters. A few weeks ago, we had a story published on globalpressjournal.com by Rehana Makbul, a reporter who lives in Srinagar and Kashmir. Now, Kashmir was just coming out of almost 100 days of lockdown that was imposed in August last year due to political unrest in that region. So they actually had been in lockdown. It was just starting to be lifted in mid-February when the government of India, you know, started looking at measures to go into lockdown because of the coronavirus. And so they just had a couple of weeks of not being in lockdown before they were in lockdown again. Rehana's story looks at the impact on the education system in Kashmir because of Students being out of school now for almost a year, over 8 months of not being in school, and the lack of capacity for homeschooling, and just the impact on students, on the education system in Kashmir because of this continued lockdown. And that kind of story could just not be reported on. It's such a nuanced analysis, the sources and the information that we get in that story. It just could not be told if our reporter didn't live in that community and hadn't been able to, she was able to collect that information over that period of time.
So one of the big questions, I think I talked with Christy about this when I visited the office. It seems like a decade ago. I think it was just December. I don't know. Was the scale question. And is there a way to integrate what you're doing with the quote unquote mainstream media as another model? I remember she was saying, yeah, we get a lot of calls from like big newspapers. I won't mention the name, where they ask us to be a fixer, like someone on the ground to guide the superstar reporter who comes into Zimbabwe or into Kashmir. And of course, that is not what the future of global press should look like. But what would be the next step that takes this to a bigger integration with the global conversation?
Well, Andy, I think there is a lot that global press has to offer and to share. And this is a complete invitation to other news organizations to join us when it comes to our duty of care approach, to join us when it comes to our style guide approach, which is essentially covering people and places with dignity and precision. That it's an invitation to share our stories, to just talk with us about places that they may not have reporters. And we're more than welcoming collaboration with mainstream newsrooms. But I do feel like we're at a turning point right now. Coronavirus is changing things for international reporting. And we're going to see a heavier reliance on local reporters, not fixers, not researchers.
Exactly.
You've heard from Kudzai today. You've heard from Minori today. 10 years of reporter, several years of reporter. It's not. It does not do justice to the kind of professional reporters that they are to treat them as anything other than that. So it's a total invitation to news organizations to work with us. There's an arm of Global Press called Global Press News Services, and Global Press News Services is our products and syndication arm of Global Press. So there are many syndication opportunities, any of our coronavirus-related stories as well. We're always looking to partner with news organizations, and that could be mainstream or not, that are interested in sharing these stories with their audience. And one thing that's really unique about the Global Press audience is we're not only focused on the U.S. market, right? We have a huge audience in Sri Lanka, in Zimbabwe, a diaspora community. Right. Of Zimbabweans around the world. But the point is that they can't get the kind of nuanced perspective, local analysis that they can get with Global Press Journal News.
And one question I had was about radio, audio, podcasting. It doesn't seem to be an area you've dived into yet, or am I missing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have many radio partners, local syndication partners around the world. We actually have hundreds of global press syndication partners that primarily focus on radio, but it's something that we want to further explore in the coming years. We've been experimenting with some of this in Mongolia and other places, but there is a lot of work to be done there. And, though Global Press has the model right, we have the values right, dignity, diversity, transparency, and excellence, we're constantly a learning and listening organization. So there's always going to be room for listening to what our reporters are saying, to what our audience is saying, and being highly adaptable to that new environment.
There's a question that came in from YouTube, which is a good one. Is the proximity of Global Press journalists to their stories, to their sources, the fact that they're local, does that affect the objectivity question, or does it make stories that much more authentic? So it's the balance there. I think it's kind of Well, maybe you could offer some thoughts on that. It's a good question.
Yeah, I love that question, but I'm sure Minori or Kudzai would have wonderful responses to that.
How do you avoid being too familiar? Now, by the way, I'll say this is not a novel question for you. I've been writing about climate change for 30 something years. I got to know literally hundreds of scientists and practitioners and campaigners. And some of them end up almost at that relationship being a friend or a colleague in that sense of someone you just deal with all the time. So this is not just a question for global press. But, you know, how do you balance that authenticity and objectivity?
Through our accuracy network, I would say. Sorry, Kudzai. I just had to pipe in here and do that.
That's great.
We both have something to say, I think. Okay, so yes, our accuracy network. We have such a fine-tuned system of ensuring balance and fairness and objectivity in our reporting. As a trainer, I can tell you that that's a huge part of the training we do during the 16-week process, is to make sure that our trainees understand what that actually means in real life reporting situations in their communities, taking into all the cultural context also that they have to balance while respecting local culture. How do you stay objective, fair, and still be very accurate and precise? So I think our accuracy process, which is a 4-tiered process, starting with local reporting, and then we have a process of fact-checking that takes place. We have copy editing, and then we also have translation into local language. And those 4 steps and tiers ensures
absolute objectivity and accuracy in our reporting.
And how does
to piggyback on that, not only is our reporting more authentic because we know how to tell the story, but it gives us unprecedented access. So I can give you an example of the story that Laxmi was talking about, the ranger story. It was a hard story to do because the 3 team members had just died in a training accident, and you can see the story on the website. It's there. So there was a barrier when it came to communication. So because I could speak to them and interview them in China, they developed a sort of a trust, like a camaraderie with me, and it made me get more access that possibly like a reporter from maybe South Africa, if they came into Zimbabwe and did that story, they probably wouldn't have gotten that much access. So not only is our proximity giving us authenticity and objectivity because of the whole editorial structure, but it also gives us access that most foreign correspondents, probably wouldn't have unless if they actually stayed in that area for a significant amount of time. I don't know if you want to add to that, Laxmi.
Yeah, no, I think, and I'm so glad you pulled up the story, Andy. I'm telling you, the photos in this story are just phenomenal. But that's exactly right. And it's a local global connection at Global Press, right? So it's our local reporters first and foremost are trained in the Global Press style of reporting, in all of our protocols, but they're also collaborating with their editors in Washington, D.C., with their fact checkers and their copy editors. And it's really a collaborative process to make sure that our final product is accurate, is precise, and really important to Global Press, that it maintains dignity. Something that I think is lost in coverage in other news organizations of the places and people that we cover.
Just great. So when you think about that next steps question in the financial context, how would that work? I know this, we're all in an arena, including at the Earth Institute, where I'm building a sustainability communication initiative, setting aside the coronavirus challenge to philanthropy as well. what's the vision for going forward financially? You know, there won't always be an angel philanthropist or the like to foot the bill. And is there some normalized way to have this work as a as a as a business model too?
You know, well, I think right now is a really interesting moment to be asking that question. Things are very different than they were 5 weeks ago, right? There's tons of research out there about the nonprofit news model, the legacy news model, and what works and what doesn't work. And I think we're all navigating that space today, learning what works and what doesn't. One thing that is phenomenal that we've seen is that, again, going back to this idea of relying on local reporters, not reporters that have to come in and out of a community, is step one, right? So making sure that you can still sustain your business, your core business of reporting during a time like this is very reassuring for an organization like Global Press. On the other hand, Global Press News Services, I was mentioning, is an invitation to not just news organizations, but other organizations, companies, education companies. For example, McGraw-Hill has a division called StudySync, and they actually syndicate our stories to students in civics classrooms across the United States. They recently just shared one of our stories from Mongolia. So there are other creative ways to think about new revenue generation that requires news organizations to think beyond just the news product and all of the other wonderful tools inside of our newsroom that I truly believe that other organizations can leverage and learn from.
That's great. We have a few more minutes. Maybe you could just describe a little bit more the next few weeks, what kind of focal points you have. I think you have a list of general themes that maybe Laxmi or Minori, you could just tick down that list of the themes you had already had as priorities, and then how this coronavirus pandemic in this juncture for humanity fits.
Yeah, absolutely. So Global Press has storytelling priorities. For example, autonomy, earth, power. These are all, coverage focus areas that we have at globalpressjournal.com. But over the next couple of weeks, seeing our coronavirus coverage in these thematic ways has been fascinating. So, Minori mentioned the story from Kashmir related to education. We also had a story from Mongolia related to how schools are managing the coronavirus crisis. We also focused on, for example, recently, just actually yesterday, we published a wonderful story about tourism. And so you'll see stories about tourism and trade and how they're being affected, the economic impact of the coronavirus. Kudzai and our team of reporters in Zimbabwe have been doing a wonderful job focusing on the economy and healthcare in Zimbabwe. But these are some of the various areas that Global Press is looking at with our coronavirus coverage. And you can see right in the top bar there, Andy, where it says news, coronavirus impact economic drivers. That's what we're focusing on this week. And you'll see that changing each week. And you'll also see these phenomenal photos that really show people what does life look like there. We all have that question of, well, what does it look to disinfect the streets in Mongolia, or what does it look like to shut down a school in Zimbabwe? The images that we're seeing, this one on the right side of the screen is an inflatable hospital in Mexico, and so it reminds us that the world is really connected. It reminds us that everyone is going through this moment, but obviously has very different concerns related to the coronavirus. And we're able to capture that both visually and through our stories. And I think, Kudzai and the team, as well as our reporters in Asia and across, Haiti and Puerto Rico and all of our Latin American countries, have just been doing a phenomenal job of navigating this new and unknown environment with such grace and poise. I'm very, very proud of the network.
And I'm very impressed with what I'm seeing. The other thing, I just want to click back to this page. The whole idea that you would categorize stories with words like autonomy, power, is so refreshing to me. They're characteristics of society. They're not like environment or technology. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Andy. It's really important at Global Press that we avoid labels, whether it's in our style guide or in our coverage categories. Labels often lead people down a path of thinking that is much too narrow for what the world is actually like. And Global Press is an invitation to see the world differently through our visuals, through our storytelling priorities, and through the tools that we use in the organization to ensure that it's dignified and precise.
I was trying to look for your style guide earlier because I love it. And it's for the same reasons you just described. After we're done, I'll post it on Twitter, the link. And I think, we all in journalism, there's all this shorthand that happens. We throw in the word climate change as if everyone has the same definition of climate change. It turns out that's a pretty thorny question. The two big agencies on the planet, the IPCC and the Framework Convention, the treaty, they actually have different definitions of the word. So this idea of examining terms, of being more precise in how you do or don't use language, is really a valuable part of what you do as well. So we're kind of at the end. I'll give each of you just a chance to, on that vision question, thinking about even next week or next month, is there a step that's I can help you with, or that you want to do? Is there a gap in your map that needs filling that we can all work together on helping to fill going forward? So maybe one quick thought from Kudzai, Minori, and then Laxmi, you get to close things out.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last bit?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the connection's a little slow. It's what's an incremental but valuable step that could be taken next week? Is there a gap in the map in sub-Saharan Africa? Is there a story crying out to be told in a different way? What could be done, and or a partnership? We've been talking for months about ways to collaborate. I think with all the scientific expertise at the Earth Institute and communication folks at the journalism school and what you're doing but who else should be in the conversation going forward? So just thinking quickly, each of you, about some step that might be make things a little bit better, a little more promising, even in a week or two or a month or two.
I think looking at Harare in Zimbabwe in general, we are, the health sector has been pretty much at the forefront of this issue, and it's been really helping that they come out and they talk to people about what they need to be doing, what masks to use, what not to use. So I think moving forward, it would be really good to keep working together with them. If they keep being more vocal, especially to us members of the media, that would really help us. I know that has helped us quite a bit when we were doing our coronavirus stories, and I hope that would continue as we move forward.
Great. And in Asia?
Yeah, in Asia, I think we're going to see a lot of our countries coming out of lockdown over the next week or 2 weeks. That's what's been announced by governments. And I think for Global Press, what we're going to really see is just these amazing stories that have been waiting to be told, that our reporters haven't been able to access. So one of the things that I'm going to be working on, and we're going to be working on as a team, is to make sure that we're supporting them as they try to gain access to all these places that have been closed, and so people, organizations, information, resources that have been inaccessible because of the lockdown that's been there for the last 4 or 5 weeks, which we hope is going to all work out in the next week or two as we come out of the lockdown. So stronger stories from Asia.
Yeah, and then it goes from the lockdown to surveillance, tracking, tracing, and becomes a new norm going forward as well.
That's right. Yes.
And Laxmi, again, thank you all for spending some time with us today. So what's your
Absolutely.
capping thought?
Yeah, I will say, well, thank you so much for having us today, Andy. This has been a great conversation, and I hope that people listening to this, to people watching this, they see that Global Press does professional, serious journalism, even during the coronavirus. This isn't advocacy journalism. This isn't citizen journalism. It's serious reporting. And it's a real invitation to mainstream news organizations to work with us, to leverage the tools that we've developed over 14 years, and to really have a mindset shift around the fact that we need to rely on local reporters, and that this is a redefining moment for international journalism.
I think you're right. So thank you all again. Globalpress.co is a good starting place for anyone to explore what we've been talking about today. And certainly look at the Twitter feed. I'm sorry that Periscope didn't work today. It's the first time that's happened, but it's still available on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Andy Revkin, my profile there, and on Facebook and on YouTube. And the links are all over our various feeds here. And let's maybe make this somewhat of a regular party. We can revisit with you periodically and try to connect on ways to make information matter, which is what my initiative at Columbia University is all about. So thanks for the audience for being here today, and please share this with others and keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Andy.